Well, yesterday I started talking about Liberty ships, but the battery ran out, so I'll continue. I had only said a few words anyway. Uh, the Liberty ship was not a beautiful ship. The lines of it were more, it was designed functionally, it was designed to hold as much cargo as possible, and in order to do that, it sacrificed some beauty. And it lumbered along at about 11 knots, which is in mileage 11 times 1.1, slightly 12 miles an hour or something like that. And it was very vulnerable because although in the early days of the war the German submarines were very slow, they quickly improved their design and they became quite offensive. And as a result, it became dangerous for a Liberty ship, say, to sail alone, which was true during the whole war. And there were times when we sailed alone, but most of the time we were in what is called a convoy. And a convoy could run up to 75 or 80 ships in rows and lined up in a very orderly manner and surrounded on the periphery by a number of either U.S. naval vessels or British or maybe a combination of the two. And the type of naval vessels that surrounded were what are called DEs, destroyer escorts, and there were some destroyers, and there were some corvettes which were an advanced version of the DE, and then sometimes there was a small aircraft carrier which had been converted from a merchant ship. They put a small landing platform on top of the merchant ship and used it to launch planes. And they were used primarily for surveillance to spot. It was very easy for them to spot a German sub under the water, and with their sonar devices, and then they would drop depth charges, or if the submarine was surface, they would use aerial torpedoes. So they became a pretty, in the South Atlantic especially, where the submarines were pretty active. I remember a couple of convoys, we had aircraft carriers. Sometimes also we sailed with blimps over the ships because the theory was that if we were attacked by, say, German dive bombers, they would get entangled in the cables running from the ship to the balloon. They weren't blimps; they were balloons. And we also had later in the war a magnetic shield around the ship, which somewhat slowed it down, but which was to ward off magnetic mines, and I think it was quite successful. But the ships lumbered along, and sometimes on some of the more dangerous routes, like going to Russia, they had, for escort, they had cruisers, much larger ships, and I think an occasional battleship, but more likely cruisers, which were pretty fast but very heavily armored. And sometimes they had a plane on board which they could catapult up, and a seaplane which could catapult up and land in the water and then be hauled back aboard the ship. So there was a commodore at every convoy, and he was usually an admiral or a captain in the Navy. And we went, the captain and me, shortly before the sailing, we went down to the Naval Building downtown New York City, and there were a whole bunch of gold-braided people, you know, a lot of high-ranking naval officers. And we, the radio guys and the captains would listen to them, and they would, to some extent, reveal the nature of the route, and in other words, sometimes where we were going. But in general, we didn't know, or at least I didn't know until I got on board the ship, and the captain gave me this attaché case, which was locked, and I opened it, and there were secret documents in it. I had the code for the secret documents, and they were generated just for that trip, and so they told where we were going and in general what route we would follow. So on board the ship, there are probably about 70 merchant mariners, and in the beginning of the war they had no armament on the ships, so they were easy prey, because the German subs were coming close to the Atlantic Ocean, to the coast, and sinking many, many ships. But the reason the big shipbuilding program, the Liberty ship program, started was that the British ships were being sunk so rapidly in the beginning of the war. They were just running out of supplies, and they were desperate for supplies. And so we carried, high explosives, aircraft, tanks, anything that could help them. And, of course, sometimes soldiers, sometimes people. The convoy route used to always what they call zigzag. It followed a zigzag route in an effort or an attempt to if a submarine pack was waiting for us, they might be somewhat fooled by that. And towards the middle of the war, we were pretty well aware of where the submarines were, because a German submarine surfaced, and they hadn't had time to throw the Enigma device over the sea into the water, and we captured it, and we solved the code. So we were able to tell. They didn't know that, so we were able to tell pretty much where they were all the time, and that really cut down the casualties. Now, when the Germans were, you might say, more gentlemanly than the Japanese, if a ship was being sunk, they didn't come and help you out of the water, although they did if they wanted prisoners, which they sometimes did, for interrogation. But that they weren't like the Japanese, who usually machine gunned everybody in the water and captured a few and killed them on the deck of a submarine. So they weren't quite like that. And they preferred to shoot at the radio room where I was, because by intercepting communication, which they would do if they hit the radio room, you couldn't warn other ships about the presence of the submarine. So towards the beginning of the middle of the war, they put heavy steel and concrete around the radio room, and that's where I was most of the time. So the crew was about 70, but then in the beginning of the war, very soon, they decided to armor the merchant ships. So they put a Navy Armed Guard crew on board, and we were never allowed to use the guns. We were only allowed to help them by bringing them barrel replacements or ammunition, but not to actually fire the guns. They fired the guns, although sometimes we did too, if they were not available or not enough of them. And they had about 8 what they call Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft guns on turrets around the ship, and on the bow they had a 3-inch 50-inch gun, a heavy gun, and a heavier gun on the stern, a 5-inch. And when we used them, they were fairly effective. So on board the ship we had a deck crew and an engine room crew. I was in the deck crew. The radio officer was in the deck crew, and so was the steward. Usually, no, I think he was considered below decks, but the purser was in the deck crew, as was the captain, the chief mate, the first mate, the second mate, the third mate, the bosun, who was in charge of the rigging and deck crew, and the ordinary seamen and the able-bodied seamen, they were all on deck. Below decks, there was the steward's department with the cooks and the cleanup detail, which changed the linen because we were officers in our cabins, that sort of thing. And there were in the engine room itself the chief engineer, a first engineer, second engineer, third engineer, almost always cadets from the Merchant Marine Academy. Those were my friends who were later torpedoed. And what they call wipers, which is the obvious term, they wiped off all the machinery and kept it clean. And the wipers and the oilers, they oiled all of it. So that's what the engine room crew consisted of. So there was always coffee in the pot in the galley down below, and also in the officers' quarters. And there was some bread and maybe sometimes donuts or muffins. So that because people came off watch all times during the night and they wanted some food. But the steward would cook up. They were on duty 24 hours. They would make eggs for you if you wanted, things like that. And down below there was the galley where the ship's crew got together and ate and conversed. I used to go down and listen to their conversations because they were more interested than those in the officers' crew. And I used to then go up and type up the dialogue, which I, of course, lost. And I had a lot of good dialogue. So most of the officers had been at sea a long time. I was a newcomer, and they were quite aware of that, and looked on me as a newbie. And but they were happy to have me there. They felt it was necessary. I wasn't allowed to transmit. I only could listen to messages, which I did. 4 on and 4 off throughout the time. When we got to port, I had nothing to do, so I got off the ship and went and toured the country for sometimes a month or 2 months, and then I reported back to the ship. So it was like a vacation, except it was a war. Usually a country at war. It wasn't that much of a vacation. So. I got to know, members of the crew as well as the officers, some of them, and I really loved going on a ship because the air became so pure. In New York City, so hard to breathe. You get out on the ocean, you could breathe, and you looked at the sun and the stars at night. You could see so many more stars. And then during the day, you were always accompanied by dolphins. They loved to come alongside. And we had sharks because the cooks dumped the refuse off the stern of the ship, so the sharks learned to follow us too. And I have a photo where the crew caught a shark and took it on board. So my days were spent in because there wasn't much activity. I wasn't transmitting. I was listening all the time. I generated a log, and I had that of the daily occurrences. I did that every day almost, and I had a typewriter in my radio room. I had my own quarters. In the Liberty ship, I didn't have my own bathroom. It was on the deck, a couple of doors away. But later on, when the war with Europe ended, I sailed on diesel ships, small diesel ships, which were coastwise. And that's when I went down to Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Caribbean side of Mexico. And they were smaller ships, much faster. And I had my own bathroom, and everything was brand new. It was really nice. And the food was much better. And I was transmitting there, because the war with Europe ended, so I was sending messages to the shore. So I guess that's about the sum of it as far as the Liberty ships. They were not a beautiful ship, but they were very necessary. And as Churchill said, they were the turning point in the war against Germany, because the supplies that were brought enabled the British and then later the Americans to carry out the land assaults, particularly against the Nazis. And the casualty rate of the Merchant Marine was the highest of any branch of service. There were more, percentage-wise, merchant seamen killed or injured or imprisoned than any other branch of the service. That's true. That's it. That was about 7 or 8 minutes.